We are now live, so I'm going to call the meeting to order. This is Thursday, February 18th. And this is the Senate Health and Welfare Committee. We're going to take up S60 again today. And this was the bill allowing municipal and cooperative utilities to offer innovative rates and services. Last time there was some question about exactly how difficult is it, and when should they have to submit and what should they have to submit to whom. And so we sent everybody home to think about it, and they're back. And Melissa Bailey, you're here. Are you spearheading this today?
I'm happy to kick things off. Thanks for having me.
Good.
Oops, you're seeing a very close-up of me, but for the record, Melissa Bailey with Vermont Public Power Supply Authority, following up with some supplemental testimony on S60, providing rate flexibility to municipal and cooperative utilities. I plan on, I'd like to respond to some of the comments and questions that came up last week when we discussed this bill, and provide some supplemental information in 3 areas. I want to provide more clarity around the rate making process that electric utilities undergo and the costs and burden associated with that process. Describe a little bit, touch on the level of transparency that already exists for municipals and cooperatives outside of the rate making process, and also provide a response to the Department of Public Services proposal for amendment to the bill that would essentially include a requirement that in order to achieve the flexibility, municipals had to undergo full rate case on a regular process of either 5 or 7 years. So just as a reminder to the committee, this bill would allow municipal and cooperative electric utilities to implement minor rate adjustments to absorb inflationary costs without the full rate that exists currently. There are thresholds when we define minor rate adjustment that includes up to 2% adjustment up or down in a 12-month period, or a 10% cumulative change from the rates last approved by the Public Utility Commission in a full rate case. And the purpose of the bill is to minimize costs borne by the utilities that are passed on directly to their ratepayers from undergoing this process, and essentially bring the regulatory burden commensurate with the activity being undertaken. So reduce the burden of the process when it's a more minimal rate adjustment that is being sought by the utility. And we see this as enabling the utilities to more efficiently cover routine costs and routine operations and inflation, and accommodate inflationary pressures. So in our view, it's a relatively minor but important degree of flexibility that would be afforded to the utilities through the bill, given the safeguards and the guardrails that are embedded within the proposed language. The bill is supported by all of the municipal and cooperative utilities in the state, not just the VEPSA members. And all of the munis and co-ops have raised concerns about the cost and burden of the rate making process as it currently stands in the state. You'll be hearing from the PUC later. I believe they're supportive of the bill and have proposed some clarifying amendments that are not substantive, but are supportive of the general concept in the bill. And VEPSA supports the PUC amendments as well. So I did provide, I will share my screen. I provided some graphics for the committee to consider that encompass the rate making process from our end. And I'm happy to share those if people don't have them right in front of them. I can go ahead.
Why don't you share?
I'll go ahead and share that. There were 2 graphics. They contain the same underlying information. One is just a little bit more visible on a screen. One includes a little bit more detail on the time commitment and cost for each of the steps in the rate making process, but I'm showing the more visually appealing graphic here. So the burden of a rate case, what are we trying to solve through this legislation? Staff estimate that the time investment for VEPSA and our member utilities. So not the regulator's costs, but just the utility costs. The burden is about 350 to 450 hours of work to prepare a rate filing. This does not include, again, this does not include the regulator's time, and it does not include legal costs. At the very end of the process, you'll see litigation schedule if necessary. That's if the department and the utility cannot agree at the end of the process, it goes to litigation. That is fairly unusual. VEPSA members have had 2 rate cases that went to litigation since 2008. So we didn't focus on that piece and did not include legal costs, again, in our estimate here of roughly $46,000 for the rate case process. Litigation would, of course, add significant time if that were undertaken. And of course, that is a risk to a utility when they open up a rate case. The highlighted portions of this are essentially spots where the rate case could potentially stop. So of course, if the local governing body, the trustee review and approval, if that was not obtained, the process would stop there. And there is a point in the process without going through a full formal hearing process where the department and the utility can essentially agree to settle on the proposed rate adjustment. And if the PUC accepted that, the rate would go into effect at that point. But you'll see there's quite a bit of labor and cost incurred prior to that. And one piece that is missing that we did not include on this process, but it may be of interest to the committee, is the notice to the public, which would be included in the filing package. When we file with the Department of Public Service and the Public Utility Commission, there would be a draft notice to customers that the PUC typically then comments on, and that then is sent to all the customers prior to the department recommendation. So we see that as a key step where customers that were concerned would have an opportunity to raise those concerns. Again, much of the burden in the rate case process comes from the prescriptive nature of the process. There is a pretty rigid structure to how these unfold, and the utility essentially is tasked with finding a year in the past and then describing every change in cost that has taken place from that year. That's what's considered the test year, and then the rate year. So again, our VEPSA's concern is that this process sometimes emphasizes process rather than content. For example, you can't typically use budgeted values in your rate case or in justifying a cost increase. They need to be both known and measurable and used and useful in the coming year. So there's some pretty strict language around estimates of cost. So if there aren't any questions on this graphic, I know there's a lot of detail here.
Okay, and this maps the blue lines, the length of them is the time involved.
Yes, that's right. That's how long it would take. And that comes through more clearly on the other graphic, but the actual duration of that activity.
Okay.
And then there's also the time investment of staff. That's how we quantify.
Which was 350 to 400 hours, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Just
you're paying the staff. Approximately how many staff? It varies.
From VEPSA side, we would probably have 3 staff involved. 2 would be pretty deeply involved. We have a specific rate staff, and then power supply, which makes up the bulk of a utility's costs. About 75% of a utility's costs come from procuring the contracts for power. So those staff would be very involved in the rate case process, and are also involved in our annual budgeting process outside of seeking rate changes.
Okay, committee, any questions at this point? Senator McDonald.
Madam Chair, one of the questions that the committee asked last week, in the traditional rate cases with investor-owned utilities, it's the hearing before the PUC where the customers have an opportunity to come in and make their views known and dispute the recommendations or the proposals. The question we asked last week is, does the language in the bill make it clear that these utilities, which are both they're customer owned, will they have held hearings amongst their own customer owners to answer concerns about the rate cases before they take advantage of this new legislative opportunity? Is the language clear that that will take place? And does the language say in the event that those opportunities have not been granted the owner customers, that would be grounds for an appeal and sending the rate case to the PUC?
So for the municipal utilities, there would be public process prior in order to reach the step of trustee approval. There would be public meetings, publicly noticed meetings where the potential rate adjustment was presented and discussed, and customers would certainly be welcome to ask questions or raise objections at that point. And that would happen prior to any filing with the department or the regulators. So I have that highlighted on the graphic here. If the bill this is the current process again. If this bill language went into effect, that step would essentially happen somewhat earlier before the communication with the department. But there's robust public participation in the municipals, and that would happen outside of and absent the regulatory process.
Yep. Prior to your filing for the request for the rate increases that this bill permits you to file for.
Yes. Yeah. The municipals are governed under their charter, and the local select board or trustees oversee the utility. And that would always happen before any regulatory filing. We would need the approval from the local.
So as I think we all believe would be expected to happen before you file. The second half of the question was, in the event that such had not taken place, is that in fact a reason for an appeal to go to the PUC because what you say customarily takes place didn't happen? Does the bill include provisions for that situation? Should it come to pass?
Senator McDonald, is your question that if we approve this bill, will there be a required opportunity for public input? And with the munis, I believe it has to be at least a vote of the trustees. Are we maintaining that voting protection? Is that the question?
But we're told what we believe ought to happen and what tradition calls for.
Yes.
In the event that it does not happen and the trustees, without consulting their owner customers, go ahead and file for one of these changes, and they have not had held internally at their own largely diminished costs and time and effort, if they haven't done that, will that be reason for the customers to say, you didn't bother to check with us, there was no process that routinely takes place, we would like to go to the Public Utilities Commission because you didn't do this?
Okay.
So the bill language does not explicitly require that. We would certainly be open to including that as a provision in the bill. I'm struggling a little because the trustees and the select boards are required under open meeting laws to carry out their process in a certain way. And it sounds like your question is, if they ignore those legal requirements, then is there recourse for the customers? And so I think we can put in explicit language that says a vote would need to happen, a vote of the governing body. And then I also think that customers would have recourse through the Public Utility Commission and the Public Service Department if their trustees or select board did not conduct business as they're required to.
Let's hold this question till it sounds like we want to go in the same place, but until we get the actual bill up and we start wordsmithing,
Okay,
that might be the best time to get into this particulars of language.
I'm prepared to wait, but the last explanation given did not satisfy me, so.
Okay, Melissa, do the towns, I just know from having to vote on water rates, because Montpelier runs a water department. Do the towns have ordinances that have certain requirements before things can happen? I'm assuming they do. I can't see any town allowing their select board without notice to raise their electric rates. You don't raise the rates, do you? Isn't that an individual? That's an individual municipal function.
That's right. VEPSA does not have any rate making ability. Each municipal would, governed by their charter, individually vote to increase or decrease the rates prior to requesting state approval of that.
And my question, Madam Chair, is we've been told that these municipal bodies that will vote to do this routinely consult their ratepayers prior to making such votes. And what I'm asking is, in the event that they should forget to do that or choose not to do that, is there an opportunity for the ratepayers to say, hey, you didn't do what you said you were going to do. We want it to go to the PUC.
Okay, if I remember correctly, there is, but I think we're going to have to be looking at the exact wording.
Yes.
Okay.
And Melissa would be better qualified to write that than I would. So.
It may actually be there, but I want to get Melissa through her slides, because right now we were talking about what it costs. And I believe we all received today actually it's a request not to make it have to be a full rate case. And we've had 2 of those now. But Stowe saying their last rate case 3 years ago cost them $180,000. And that was in legal and witness fees, not in staff time. So that I've checked, I believe it was sent to all the committee members, so you can read that letter. But Melissa, why don't you continue through your slides?
Sure, happy to. Yep, we did see Stowe's filing, and essentially that would pick up the piece that was not included in VEPSA's estimate of staff time, the very last piece about litigation, I believe is what Stowe was referencing. So I did just want to briefly touch on, again, this slide lays out the current process. And I did just want to touch on the process as we envision it if the bill were to take effect. Essentially, the first several steps in this process would happen. We picture this, we envision this as during the annual budget process, the town would essentially notice or identify the need to go in for a rate adjustment. VEPSA, as I mentioned, VEPSA provides power supply budgets, 5-year power supply budgets on an annual basis to our members in December, identifying, again, a bulk of their costs. 75% of their costs would be driven by that budget. And so we envision that the process would be during their annual budget approval on town meeting day. They would identify whether the utility was in need of a rate adjustment. And once that approval from the local governing body had come, there would be a 45-day window. Essentially, we would notify the department and the Public Utility Commission and likely ratepayers of the intent to adjust the rates. And the PUC or department would be able to essentially object. We also envision that during that 45-day window, there would likely be some back and forth between the utility and the regulators regarding additional information that was needed. That happens kind of throughout the process now. I think it's referenced as informal review and discovery. Essentially, the department can ask the utility questions and the utility can respond to those prior to the formal process. So that's the way that we envision the proposed process embedded in this bill. And at the end of that 45-day period, either the department could essentially sign off on the rate adjustment or recommend that the PUC let the rate adjustment go into effect, or raise a concern and say that, during our back and forth with the utility, we're still not satisfied that this is a justified rate adjustment. And we want to kick off into the existing process, the current, what we're calling the full rate process. So if there aren't any other questions on this process document.
Any questions, committee, on this
Yes, I
process?
have one. I
Okay,
have one,
Senator
Madam.
Pearson.
Melissa, it's not precisely on this process, but generally, a lot's been made of, as we've talked about this, around inflation costs, and there are therefore a need for the munis to make small adjustments. But obviously, when you're doing these more onerous rate cases, there is a understanding as you go in that this is going to cover the next several years, right? I mean, I guess my question is, how do you deal with inflation as just an example today? There's no way that you're set for 5 years and then suffering for 5 years while you try to avoid a rate case. So just help me understand the calculation that happens today.
Yeah, so we mentioned inflation, and again, it's the degree to which the utilities costs are affected by inflation. So many of those costs might be locked in for a set period of time. We talk about inflation, but wages might not go up commensurate with inflation, right? They may be stagnant, or, power supply costs in particular can fluctuate year to year. So I think that the best answer to your question is there are so many variable moving pieces that costs just don't go up on a straight trajectory with inflation. There are some costs that might be reduced and others that might be increasing over time. So that's, I think, what's enabled the rates to stay in effect for longer periods of time rather than annually increasing by a small increment.
I guess what I mean is the utilities don't have like a big reserve that they can lean on, I'm assuming. So basically, because the process today is onerous, there are some lean years, and you go through the last as many lean years as you can handle, and then you go back. Is that right? I mean, I'm assuming I'm not imagining that. So if we permit this change, wouldn't we expect that ratepayers, that tendency will change, and that it'll be very easy to take a very small, modest increase every year, and therefore ratepayers are going to see a steadier rate. Maybe they won't have one rate and then a big jump, but they are actually won't this new process potentially discourage some of the kind of lean attitude that, in fact, the onerous process commands?
Okay, I think I do understand your question. And to be fair, there are lean years and there might be some, more less lean years where revenues actually exceed, expectations. So that is balanced over time. In terms of whether they have a reserve, I don't think that there's a deep, there are deep pockets in the municipal utilities, but there is money in the bank essentially from those years where more revenue is taken in than goes out the door. So I would say those balance out over time. It sounds like your question was, one, will this lead to more steady rate increases potentially than what we see now, which is utilities going as long as they possibly can and then coming in with a significant rate request. That's our hope, is that there will be steady adjustments. But it sounded like the second part to your question was, will the ultimate result be in greater increases in rates for customers. And I actually don't think that that is the case. There is, I can't emphasize enough the strong aversion that the municipals have to raising rates. They do not want to go before their customers and say, we raised your electric rate last year and now we're coming back to raise it another 2%, but don't worry, it's only 2%. They avoid rate increases. They do everything they can to absorb those cost pressures. They do run very lean operations. So this flexibility, VEPSA would be in the position of encouraging our members to come in more often for rate increases. But we do not expect, it would be extremely rare for frequent rate increases. We don't think people will be coming in for 2% annually for 5 years. Our expectation is that it'll be 2% maybe every few years. It's just inherent in the municipals is this aversion to raising rates and going back to the local community with those proposals. I hope that's responsive to the question.
Yeah, thank you.
Those are elected positions, right? So
Typically, the governing body is elected.
yeah,
Or
So-
appointed by an elected official.
need to be convincing. I've been watching Texas with some interest, but one of the things they've said is because this is an unregulated, they didn't do regular maintenance because they didn't have to. And that to me would be a concern. You know, if during those lean years, you didn't do some of the things maybe you should have done because you didn't, you waited and waited until you couldn't wait anymore. And there is a risk that something bad could happen. So I think we're trying to find that balance and make sure that that the process is not so onerous and so expensive that I believe I'm not going to get back into the dental analogies that we got into last week. Senator Sorotkin.
So I'd like to just follow up on Senator Pearson's line of questioning. I think you've made some distinctions already between municipal-owned utilities and GMP or a privately held utility. I don't know, Madam Chair or Senator McDonald or other witnesses remember, but we had a huge fight over this in the context of GMP. And ARP on behalf of ratepayers was in saying we've got to get rid of alternative rate setting because it's costing customers a lot of money, and the exact opposite is being asked here. They want to go to alternative rate setting where they can get periodic small increases all along. So, and I remember that, I'm not 100% sure how it came out. I think we did take away or limit the ability of GMP to do alternative rate setting. And here we're being asked to allow for alternative rate setting. So I'd just like to ask the witness or anybody else to weigh in why this is different than a privately owned electric company.
Sure. I mean, I'd be happy to weigh in on that. The key difference being that these are publicly owned utilities that are directly responsive to their customers and governed by their customers. So there is that degree of accountability that does not exist with an investor-owned utility. There is, I'm not sure what change you're referring to. I know Green Mountain Power does operate under an alternative regulation plan. I'm a GMP customer. I do get notices occasionally that it's called their fuel adjustment clause. They're able to modify rates on a regular basis without the full rate case. And again, the intent here is to reduce the costs that the utilities incur by going through this process. So
you don't remember a few years back there being a battle royale over this? I thought the result is that we limited to some degree GMP's power to use alternative rate.
Michael, I don't think I was on the board on this committee when we did it.
I think
but
you're
I
right.
believe
you're
we
right.
had, they had to go through, they went through a full-blown rate case.
And maybe
That-
that was the solution, that we forced a blown rate case sooner
Yeah.
than otherwise would have happened. But I know it was customers versus the utility, and the complaint was that this alternative rate case where you didn't have to keep coming back to the PUC was exactly the issue. And the consumers were on the side of keeping the traditional rate making process.
Okay, maybe when we get to Riley Allen, he can refresh our memory on this. Would that work?
Yes.
I'll give him a few minutes to refresh his memory if he needs to. Okay, Melissa, can we go on to the next slide?
Yes, and luckily I only have 2 slides for you today. So this was also a handout, and just wanted to speak to a little bit of the transparency that already exists and is embedded. This is kind of in reaction to testimony last week that essentially a rate case is needed for regulators to kind of look under the hood of the utility. And that's not consistent with VEPSA's experience. In our view, the rate case is really the backstop. There are multiple reporting requirements that municipal and cooperative utilities comply with that range from the planning phase to the operations phase. And the rate case is really the backstop to look at costs, essentially once they've already been incurred. So this is just a sampling. I'm not going to go through it. But again, it does highlight the high degree of visibility and transparency that regulators have into utility operations and utility financials, absent the rate making process. And again, the intent of the bill is really to bring the process in line with, again, the activity being contemplated by the utility. So again, a minor rate adjustment potentially shouldn't carry the same burden as a higher rate adjustment. And at the bottom, of course, is the statutory language that gives the department broad authority to request essentially any information at any time from the utilities. So again, we want to be responsive to our regulators. We feel that we are typically responsive to the regulators. And again, the concern is really, is the full process needed in order to satisfy that desire for transparency and visibility, which we do think is important. And that's the end of my slides. I do just want to react to the department's proposal for amendment that I think you will be hearing presented from Mr. Allen shortly. We have gone back and forth a bit on this idea of whether there's a need for a time-based rate case required in order for the municipal and cooperative utilities to implement rate flexibility. And our concern is that that's not consistent with the intent of the bill, which is really to reduce that burden where there's where the magnitude of the rate change is small. And from a practical standpoint, we've heard from our members, they essentially wouldn't use the legislation if there were a time-based component. And VEPSA's view is that it's more important and more appropriate to have, again, the 2% annual threshold and 10% cumulative threshold, rather than a time-based component, which feels a little bit artificial. There's not necessarily a right time to go in for a rate case. If your forecasts were in line and your costs and revenues came in as expected for a long period of time, we question the need to go in for a full rate case if, say, in year 6 or 7, you have the need to raise rates to 2%. We would question whether a full-blown rate case were needed at that time. We're also concerned that this, if you put in this 7-year threshold or a time-based threshold, it essentially creates a perverse incentive for the utilities, right? If I'm a utility, I would go in and do my rate case this year, and then the incentive would be to raise rates 2% every year pretty quickly before that 7-year clock runs out, and avoid going in again for the full rate case. Whereas we can envision with this bill, some municipals going in this year, doing a full-blown rate case, waiting another 5 years before needing to look at a 2% rate increase, and then probably waiting a few more years to do another minor rate adjustment. So again,
Donald has a question.
Just, the witness has just said the incentives were, and she described them. The incentives for co-ops and municipals are not the same incentives as for investor-owned utilities. And that's and that needs to be recognized. And the reason that this seems to be a friendly bill and a thoughtful one is because they are indeed investor-owned utilities and have built in the owners are the customers. So this makes sense. Senator Sorokin asked about what was the problem that was discussed a few years ago, and it was that the current rate cases for investor-owned utilities allow them to game the system on the other side for their stockholders. So the witness was speaking towards the incentives for this group of utilities only, correct?
That's right.
Thank you.
Just relevant to this bill, and agreed that the governing structure of municipals and co-ops and them differently than an investor-owned utility, and does provide a greater voice for customers in decision-making at the utility level. So again, just finishing up on the DPS proposal for amendment, we're receptive to changes that could give regulators a degree of comfort with, with the process. But again, a requirement for a full rate case on an arbitrary timeline doesn't sit well with the municipals and does not essentially meet the need that's being requested here. And I would point out that of course, any embedded in the bill language is the option for the DPS to raise a concern anytime a utility comes in to raise rates. So if the DPS feels like 7 years is a magic number and they really want a full rate case after 7 years, even with the bill language as written, they have that ability to initiate that process. So again, we would not be supportive of any firm time-based guidelines included in the bill.
Okay, so right now, looking at that list of information, the regulators, all of them, can get basically any piece of paper you've gotten. And they can look at it, and if it's raises some flags, then they can say, you've got to come in for a rate case now. So I'm wondering what anyone gains or loses if we put a time on it. I mean, it sounds like all the information's there and the regulators have access to that information anytime they want. Your governing boards are usually your select boards who are elected, who operate under public meeting. So they have to hold their discussions publicly. And I assume all the documentation is also available to customers, right?
Yeah, there would be, yes.
Okay.
Those are public, yep.
All right. Okay, any questions for Melissa? Sandra Hardy.
I'm not sure if this is a question for Melissa or for Luke. Are we going to hear from him later? I'm just looking at current law and I'm trying to figure out, because there's already a whole section about alternative regulation of electric and natural gas companies. So there's obviously some kind of alternative rate setting situation already in current law. And I'm assuming I don't know, I don't want to assume anything. I don't know that much about this area yet, but that it doesn't apply to the municipals. Is that correct? It only applies to GMP? But again, this might be a question for Luke, not you, Melissa.
I can take a stab at that.
Okay, you got an answer? That's good.
Well, the statute can apply to municipals and cooperatives. Our experience has been that the alt-reg structure doesn't necessarily work well for munis and co-ops because we don't have the profit motive of an investor-owned utility. And I think the alternative regulation plan that's in effect for Green Mountain Power does allow for some kind of essentially cost sharing or profit sharing, I'm sorry, with the company itself and shareholders. So that doesn't apply for municipals and cooperatives. This did come up in our conversations about this bill with the Public Utility Commission. They said, hey, you've already got the ability to apply for an alt-reg plan. And that is an avenue that we could explore. There's some process that would be, it would, have to take place in order to do that with the PUC. And again, we have 11 municipal electric utility members of BEPSA. So our view was this is a step towards alternative regulation without, again, needing to go through that full process. If this bill, we're hopeful that this bill goes forward as is, but if not, we could certainly pursue the alt-reg path. Again, there'd be some burden associated with that as well.
Okay, so what you're saying, I'll just paraphrase maybe, is that the as proposed in S60, it's sort of alt-reg light that's like not as, that fits your feet better. That the process that's in there it doesn't really work for these tiny little municipal electric companies.
I'd agree with the characterization of alt-reg light. It would get us the alt-reg that would be most useful for the utilities.
Okay, thank you. I see Luke popped up.
Yeah,
so I don't
Luke,
know if
do
he-
you have anything to add to this?
I agree with what Melissa said. So understand that the alternative regulatory structure in current law, munis or co-ops could use that. I think the bill started because they don't find that current process helpful. And that's a policy call, but they could use it. So I agree with Melissa as to that. The second issue I wanted to touch on is I wanted to also confirm what you said earlier about the governing body of the muni having to approve any rate adjustment or rate change. If you look on current law, which is 218 small d A, you'll notice that in that A, there's language that any alternative regulation would have to be pre-approved by the governing body of the muni or the co-op members. But remember, in this bill, for the new law we're adding, we're notwithstanding A. So if you want the state law to require pre-approval, we can easily put that language back in the relevant subsections we're adding. So they have to now, under the current bill, they have to, under their charters, as Melissa said, but not under state law, we can add it back in. So they have to do it both under their charters and under the state statute. Was that clear? Thank you.
Their charters still hold,
There's
it would-
charters would still apply. That is accurate.
and we could put it as a state requirement also. If
Yes, and the state law would also.
boots and
trump the
suspenders or
charter.
belts and suspenders.
Yeah.
It's more,
Both.
it's
Boots and
neither, it's a matter of a hierarchy. So
Yeah.
state law trumps charter, state law trumps regs, state law trumps municipal law. So it's important to remember who trumps who.
So Luke, can I follow up with a question? Thank you, Senator Cummings. So what's in statute right now? I'm looking at it, what you just referenced. Two questions is, so this process that's in there right now, if the municipals are not following it, who, is it just Green Mountain Power or are there other that
So
might be using this?
I
don't
can't
know.
answer
I'll
that
ask-
question.
I'll ask them
I've never handled a rate setting case in my life. So
Okay.
that's something
okay.
that Melissa or DPS or other folks could answer.
So I
Sorry,
do
can't
have-
answer that one.
No, I have a drafting question for you now then. So 218DA starts with notwithstanding. So if we're notwithstanding a section that's notwithstanding something else, is a double notwithstanding, how does that work?
You can,
That's why we
You
have
can
lawyers.
you can keep notwithstanding. I think it's okay.
Okay.
We'll
makes
make sure, we can make sure it's clear. We
It's
can,
circular. Okay,
we can make sure it's clear, but
we'll make it work. Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Melissa, I'm going to get back to a more basic question. You've got X number of members. They're munis, all right? I'm not remembering the exact number, 7, 8,
11.
11. All right, my next guess was 10 or 12. You do the power purchase, help them with that. When you go in for a rate case, does you do the rate case for all 11 members, or do you do it for one or two? Do all the members have to vote to go in? How does that work when you've got all kinds of members?
Sure. Yeah, I can answer that. We manage each individual member's power supply completely independently. So they are
Okay,
standalone.
so you would go in for Northfield Electric or Swanton, who I gather is doing just fine with their dam. But you would go in and it would be based on their individual books, needs, power supply,
That's right.
customer base, and they would have to get the approval of, I'm pretty sure it's the select board.
Typically the select board or the village trustees. would be the-
Okay, that's,
It would just be that one utility going in for that rate case, that we manage them completely separately.
so you
Madam
might
Chair,
have
this
to
is-
go through this process 11 times.
No.
Yes.
This is the point when the process that the trustees have to go through in consulting their member owners is spelled out, I imagine, in the various
Charters.
bylaws. Is that
Yes.
correct? Okay.
The charter and
My question has been, if they fail to do that and they go to the PUC under this new law, does the bill contain a remedy for the customer owners to say, hey, they didn't come to us as the bylaws call for, therefore the request is off, has to be reinstituted, or the customer wants to have it done, customer owner at the PUC, the old fashioned, go to the PUC and get your approval. That's
Okay,
my only
and I
question.
think that's covered in the wording. There was, anybody could submit a concern to the department. There was a trigger, because the concern was if one disgruntled customer could trigger a full-blown rate case, and there are people who file cases because they can, what are we gaining if one customer could,
Perhaps Luke could speak to
well, that's who I'm
language
looking
that
at,
we're-
Senator, not you.
the language that would
Can we let Luke
stop
speak?
the problem.
Luke,
Short answer, yes, but it's not specific. So as you'll see on page 2, for example, under 2, it talks about unless an objection is filed. So some person or entity could file an objection. The objection perhaps could be on the basis of what Senator McDonald is saying, but there's nothing specific to that exact scenario.
Nail that down and you got my vote.
Well, I'll wait for the committee to decide how they wish to change it, but we could nail it down if the committee wishes.
okay, Senator Sirotkin.
So I hate to be cynical here, but I probably support this bill, but I'd like to make sure we have the proper guardrails and belts and suspenders. I have been guilty of saying boots and suspenders. In fact, I saw one time where I said boots and suspenders and belts and suspenders in the same sentence. I couldn't believe it. It's one thing to say, this is our utility, we're the ratepayers, but the same thing could be said of school boards. They come ahead, they put proposals in, the voters vote them down because they feel it's too self-aggrandizing, or they're trying to make the school bigger than they want. I'm sure Senator Brock will enjoy hearing me say that nonprofits and municipalities could be as administratively costly as the private sector, if not more in some cases. So I don't necessarily buy into the fact that that because this is a municipality and it's ratepayer owned, that what is going to be proposed is going to be fully protective of the public. And I think Senator McDonald is right on. We need some specific ways to have some checks on this that makes this overall process work and is safe. That's all I have to say.
Okay. We have been through more than half our time and we're still on our first witness. So what my plan is we're going to continue because we're focused and I want to get this work through today. I'm going to give you your break and we are going to do Commissioner Tierney and the stuff we have to get to appropriations by Tuesday. So we may have to ask Joyce Manchester to come back on the principles of a high quality tax system. But I know Faith is listening and has probably moved this, we'll let her know, but I want to let Melissa finish her testimony. And then we're going to move on. Maybe we will finish this up in time, but get specific questions that we want answers to, and then we'll do a line by line going through the bill and markup. That's why I miss having a bill, because I can't put red flags on the margins. I'll have to print this one out for myself. Okay, Melissa, have you?
So I think I've covered what I need to cover. I will just say we're receptive to language, more explicit language in the bill that requires the local approval. We certainly support that. We think it's a given, but if there's needed changes, we're supportive and appreciate the committee's time today. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. We're going to move on to Andrea Cohen. So we've been through munis, now we got co-ops.
I'm going to be really brief because I'm interested in what the PUC and DPS have to say as much as you are about some of these great questions that are being asked. I'm just going to reinforce what BEPSA was just sharing. We did do a little research. I wanted to report back that what I found was very consistent in terms of the length of time to do a rate case, 3 to 4 months at minimum, considerably longer if litigated or contested. Our costs track closely with what BEPSA shared as well, using a conservative 8 weeks of time. We might have 4 people working about 10 hours a week, which gets us to about 400 hours if we're being conservative. And if it's a contested case, of course, we're going to add more, maybe 80 more hours. And then we also have additional costs for outside legal counsel and consultants. So we think there's opportunity. We don't think the system's terrible. There's some nice guardrails and accountability. It is very time consuming. It does sometimes put the wrong incentive, in terms of not coming in and pushing off needed, incremental increases. So we think it would serve our members well to not come with those big chunk increases. Our last rate case was effective January 1st, 2020, and that was the first one we had in 6 years. We probably should have done one sooner, but it really kind of is a disincentive to coming in. We have, as Melissa spoke about, a lot of different cost pressures. Some of them we can mitigate in other ways. So, there's a lot of variables and a lot of things that we try to control, but we really try to avoid doing anything unnecessary. But we don't want to defer maintenance. We don't want to not invest in our system. We got to keep the lights on. We got to stay safe. We got to, have a clean power supply. We want to do all those things. So sometimes you do have to come in. So the short story is we do support the bill. There were 2 minor tweaks that we were interested in. One Luke was speaking about the clarity about what happens in the process if someone objects. I don't know if that just automatically puts you into a full rate case or whether you can cure the concern, and continue with this kind of modified process. So that would be good. I don't know if we could do that in rules or it needs to be in statute or just get something on the record about what that process would be. And then we recommended just a minor tweak about effective. We just had our rate case January 1st, 2020. We'd like to get that in and be eligible for this opportunity. So just a minor tweak about rates that were approved that were in effect on or after January 1st, 2020, just a minor change. So I know DPS has some language that they'd like to share, and we're happy to participate and certainly answer any questions that you might have for the co-op.
Okay. And the starting date for you and for Stowe right now that have,
Oh, Stowe too.
Stowe sent us a letter, and I guess they've had one 3 years ago and it was very expensive.
Right. So I'm happy to
So-
stay on and just be here, but if you want to jump to the DPS, I'll be here. If you want me to come back in, I can be kind of on hold here.
Okay, committee. Senator Pearson.
Andrea, a lot has been talked about for the expense. These rate cases can be very expensive, and a lot of times that has to do with lawyers. But that's sort of
Michael is not happy with that statement.
well, that's been the testimony, Senator Sorokin. But that sort of assumes that that's not an acceptable use. I mean, it only gets complicated if there are complications, and the system, as I understand it, is in some ways designed to protect ratepayers. So all of these expensive rate cases, like I guess what I'm asking is, isn't there value when there's an expensive rate case? Isn't that because it warrants something and there's a pushback that then the utility has to counter? I mean, isn't that tension actually exactly as we've designed the system over the years? You see my question?
Yeah, I think there's times when there's value add from that, but I think our preparation is the same regardless. We're going to put a lot of effort into making sure, our finance team crunches all the numbers constantly, and then some of this is kind of may feel like value add, sometimes not. From what I'm hearing from our team, there's just some, efficiencies that could be had. Like I said, I don't think it's like majorly a mess or anything like that. I think it's just, it's a big lift and a lot of process, not always value add. It could be expedited for these de minimis types of things. Something that's more complicated certainly is still going to go through, more robust process. I guess the department can answer that too, but they're pretty engaged with us always. So
All right, well, maybe that would be good to go on to Riley. If there are no other questions for Andrea. Okay, Riley.
I'm here.
Okay, thank you. So for the record, Riley Allen, Deputy Commissioner of the Vermont Department of Public Service. And I'll just provide kind of a summary of points that I'd like to make. Before I do, I just wanted to kind of remind the committee what I think the commission reminded us last time, which is one of the reasons that Vermont is one of the few states that actually rate regulates the munis in particular, is that there's not always a match between the voter base and the customer base of the municipalities. That is, the voters are represented and have the governance of the municipality through the select board and the village trustees. But if you're outside the municipal boundaries and you are a member of the utility, you don't necessarily have that same degree of representation. That said, I also wanted to remind the committee, kind of in the title of the bill, it's really focused on some flexibility to introduce innovative services, but all the conversation is focused on a separate topic, which is additional flexibility to essentially allow incremental rate increases of 2% and up to 10% over time. But last year, we actually introduced the portion of the bill, the second portion of the bill that related to kind of innovative services. We think it's important that our utilities, frankly, innovate and trial and test and pilot services, because the world is beginning to get a little more complex. And I can talk about that if you want to, but we're just kind of skirting that and focusing on the front end of this bill, which is the additional rate flexibility. From the department's standpoint, we actually think it's sensible to have some additional degree of rate flexibility. I know it's concerning from the department's perspective when the utilities quite sensibly wait for a period of time before they come in for a rate increase, and then the rate increase is a fairly substantial rate increase. Typically, it's in the neighborhood of 10%, sometimes much more. I don't think I've ever seen one from a municipal system that's below 4.5%. From the co-ops, they're different. They come in and they'll introduce rates of 2 or 3%. But from the municipal systems, they're typically waiting, and that's causing stress on their system. There are kind of dynamics that aren't really healthy for the system, and so we like the idea of them being able to essentially adjust costs, on a more fluid way, and to avoid the burden that I think they're trying to kind of put off in not moving forward on a rate increase. So having some lesser threshold for increases actually does make sense to us. We do think that we've gone through an unusual period in the last 10, 12 years. There have actually been very few kind of municipal rate cases over the last 10 years. We think that rate cases, as we've kind of alluded to in the past, are a part of the process. That tension is healthy. What we learn in the process is healthy. The expertise that exists on a select board or among the village trustees is different than that exists at the Department of Public Service. And so the vetting can be, the questions asked and the vetting can be, a heavier lift. And I think that lift helps to make the utilities as good as they are. They do a good job when they come in, especially, our recent experience with the co-ops has actually been quite good. When they come in, the presentation of the information is organized and well presented and compelling, and it's much easier to essentially let those rates kind of go in as is without the pain and anguish of a full rate proceeding. As Melissa pointed out, there are a few times here and there where we have to go to a full-blown rate case, but that's pretty uncommon. Usually, we can kind of work through things out before we have to kind of go through the additional hurdles that are associated with a full rate case. We like the idea of customer notice, as Senator McDonald notes. If it's not included in the legislation, the department will certainly kind of address that through rulemaking. But we think it's important that customers receive notice of any rate increase and that there be some mechanism to kind of voice their concerns with that rate increase. So if it's included in law, we would support that. If it's not included in law, we intend to address that in the rulemaking process. We support, we came in before, supported 5 years. We've tried to hear the concerns of the municipalities, and we feel that timeliness is, an element of the conversation. We think if it helps them to, feel better about the process, we feel that 7 years would be just as fine and would address our concerns. So we've offered some language that I passed along to Faith that would provide 7 years. And just so you're aware, I also included a graphic that just kind of shows what a rate case process is and how things differ between investor-owned utilities and municipal utilities. I think given the timeframes available, I'd say that's, I won't call that out, but I'll just call it out that the difference between the investor-owned utilities and the munis and co-ops is that when they propose a rate, that rate will go into effect after 45 days. It is subject to refund. So if there is a fully litigated case and the number comes out in a different place, the monies get refunded on customer bills after that rate case is concluded. And that's different than the investor-owned utilities. And I think it kind of plays to some of the conversation we were having about alternative regulation, why the co-ops and munis kind of don't see a fit, and why the investor-owned utilities might see a fit. Investor-owned utilities are looking at 8.5 months before that proposed rate will go into effect. And given the volatility of energy and power markets, sometimes that can create some more variability in earnings. It's pretty important to the investor-owned utilities that they have the flexibility that is associated with some form of alternative regulation, but the co-ops and munis don't feel that same kind of pressure. I'll stop there. I guess one of the points we wanted to make is that for large utilities, the process is actually quite different. It's a major kind of burden on the department. Typically, we involve outside experts to come in, but that's largely for the Green Mountain Powers and the Vermont Gases. Used to be CVPS. Typically, the co-op muni cases are much smaller, and as I indicated, our experience has been over time that our utilities, with the timely introduction of a rate increase, there are economies in that effort. They get better at it. There's just a better kind of communication between us, and efficiencies are realized in that process. I'll pause there for questions.
Senator Bray.
Hi, Mr. Allen. Good to see you again. I have a question about the protection for towns outside the host municipality for the utility. Are there no protections now so that they can't basically face a sort of a prejudicial tariff that favors the village and leaves them paying higher rates outside the village? Or is that protection only by virtue of going through a rate case?
The language of the proposal is pretty clear that what it would apply to any of the flexibility that applies would apply throughout the system. So there's no opportunity through the proposal in S60 for the customers outside of the municipal boundaries to be disproportionately affected by a rate change. I've never, I think the general oversight of the commission has helped to kind of provide that assurance of just and reasonable rates that apply to all ratepayers, and I'm pretty sure that a discriminatory rate that applied to just those outside the municipal boundaries would be viewed as unjust and unreasonable.
Okay. And I know that we're asking utilities to do, consider, well, innovate. You were talking about innovation. There's a lot going on these days. So for instance, EV charging tariffs to support that transition, or tariffs for battery storage that's under the utilities control, demand reduction techniques, all that stuff. Do those all need to be built into a rate case, or is there a way that one of the a case, should it come under S60 if it were enacted, that it would include enough flexibility so that that innovation could take place without necessarily coming back for another approval? I mean, I think, as I understand it, alt reg allows for notification of the PUC and department that we're going to do this, that, or the other experiment, but it's within guardrails already defined. Is that allowed for in S60, or?
I don't want to, well, S60 clearly encourages the flexibility that would be associated with, offering up a pilot. It gives a period of 18 months for that pilot to occur, and then at the end of that pilot, that rate offering will essentially conclude unless there's a further request to extend or modify that pilot. And we think those pilots are healthy instruments that have worked very well among at least with Green Mountain Power, and we would like to see a similar dynamic present itself with the co-ops and munis, because we think frankly, Green Mountain Power is doing a good job with those pilots, and but each of our systems are different, and so how they would take what Green Mountain Power or Burlington is doing on the innovation front and apply it to their own system is likely to have to vary. And so trialing things and finding out what works makes a lot of sense, and it's just a little more clumsy if it's a formal tariff that has to be offered and then kind of rescinded at some point later.
Right. So on the innovation front, then at least S60 would be helpful for that kind of piloting and innovation work.
That's right.
Great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Any other questions? Senator Hardy.
Thank you for laying out clearly what you support and what you don't, or your suggestions. And the question I had before, I think you answered, but I want to make sure that I understand what you said about why, why the munis or the smaller companies may not be using the statutory flexibility that's there. And you said that because the sort of investor-owned utilities are more likely to use it because of this 8-month period where they can't go, where they're not. Can you just clarify the 8-month period? That's where I'm getting caught up.
Sure. So between the period in which for the investor-owned utilities, so for Vermont Gas and Green Mountain Power, between the point at which they actually file a case, there's a 45-day period that follows before that rate would take effect, unless an investigation is kind of opened. The department has 30 days to essentially make a recommendation to the commission. Almost always with an investor-owned utility, we recommend an investigation. And then once that kind of 45-day window ends for the commission to kind of open an investigation, there's a 7-month period in which they need to actually, review the evidence and conclude matters so that rates can go into effect. So that full 8.5-month period it's a long period, and given the potential variability in power costs, that can create some unsettling impacts on their financial performance during that time. So alternative regulation provides that flexibility, especially in the power cost side, that I think helps to address a lot of their anxieties. That munis and co-ops have rates that automatically go into effect after 45 days once that rate case is filed. But if the matter is investigated, that those rates can go into effect and a portion of them can be refunded after that point. So if there's a pressing change in power markets or whatnot, that dynamic is, that dynamic is more easily addressed in the co-op and muni environment than it is from the IOU environment. That said, I think that, I don't want to speak on behalf of the munis too much. That these are just kind of the logical conclusions that I've reached. I also think that using alternative regulation, it usually comes with all the standards that are in 218D that Luke could help us with, but they have to meet certain standards in order for that alternative regulation framework to take hold. And that, meeting all those standards and designing something that makes sense is a bit of an effort. And I think it's for a small system, that's just kind of too heavy of a lift for them to move forward, especially given the framework that exists for them under kind of normal rate making circumstances.
Okay, so basically the flexibility is not flexible enough.
It's not the flexibility
for the munis.
Again, I don't want to speak for them, but my assessment is that the flexibility isn't worth the additional increment of flexibility isn't worth the heavy lift that is associated with pursuing a 218D type framework.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, any other questions? I'm going to move on to Tom Nauer. Okay, Tom, floor is yours. I was lost.
Great.
Okay.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tom Nauer. I'm the Policy Director with the Public Utility Commission. Last week, my colleague Joan White testified regarding S60, and Ms. White stated the PUC's position, which is supportive of the bill, subject to several editorial changes that the Commission provided to Ms. Bailey on February 5th, which was prior to Ms. White's testimony. And the position that Joan spoke about last week remains the Commission's position today. So that's where we stand, and I'm happy to answer questions from the committee.
Can you just list what your conditions were?
Yes. So these were a few changes, and we did provide these to Melissa. I'm happy to send it to Luke or to Faith.
Are these just technical changes, or are they?
We have some more notwithstandings. We try to get rid of what we saw as some redundant language. They're clarifying edits.
Okay, but in general, you support this coming up with an alt reg light. I think it's been being called.
Yes, we are.
Okay. All right. What about the requirement that they come in at least once every so many years?
Right. So, the bill as drafted and as we've proposed amending it contains no time constraint. And so we would remain supportive of the bill without a time constraint. We understand that the department would prefer that it would contain a time constraint. And they've proposed 7 years, and we would not object to that. And I'll leave it there.
Okay, committee, any questions?
Senator,
Okay, I'm working on schedules here, rearranging Senator Sirotkin and then Senator Pearson.
so going back to Senator McDonald's concern, I think Luke said something that there's general language of if somebody or absent any objection. I feel like I'm entering the world of Act 250 here, but what if one person objects? Can it throw this into a full rate case? Is there any threshold on what triggers a full rate case, and should there be? How would I don't have the bill in front of me, so maybe Luke can help me, or maybe you, Tom, can help
Riley,
saying how that language would be viewed by the Public Utility Commission.
Right. Yeah. So I'll take a stab at this. The bill as drafted says the commission may establish by rule or order standards and procedures for implementing and interpreting this section. So I can't prejudge today what those standards and procedures might be with respect to an individual customer objecting. So I can't answer that directly, but I can say that, the commission would be very inclined to establish by rule or order standards. And they would certainly have to address this provision that you're bringing up. And I will also highlight in existing law under section 208, that's the provision for complaints to be filed. They can be filed directly with the PUC or with the Public Service Department. So existing law also addresses this, and I'm not sure that S60 changes that existing provision.
I'm sorry, who would prepare the rules and regulations, the PUC or the PSD?
As S60 is drafted, is the commission.
Okay, thank you.
I remember discussions where the department acts as kind of a gatekeeper, I guess, and I think that might be more inciting decisions, but that they work to figure out, because I don't think we're going to get very far if one disgruntled customer can throw in an entire thing into a full-blown rate case. And I think the idea is to encourage rate adjustments so that they don't wait 10 years and then come in at 10 or 12%, but that they are kind of flow up more gradually. And make sure that the public knows they're flowing up but if a rate case is so painful that the munis, and it sounds like the munis more than the co-ops, and again, munis tend to be smaller than the two co-ops we have. That if we aren't going to gain anything if we don't have some kind of a gatekeeper on this, so that just one disgruntled person can throw it into a full rate case. Senator McDonald.
Madam Chair.
Yes.
I don't, we always seem to get into extremes, but all the entities that would be, the 11 entities that would be seeking this undoubtedly have provisions to listen to their customers and to act on their behalf and to have hearings. And in their procedures, they no one ratepayer is going to be able to make them do something that doesn't represent the customer base. That's not the problem. The problem is if the governing body just doesn't even bother to listen to them and goes to get a rate case, that's a problem, and it should be spelled out. I think both the last two witnesses have said it can be done in rule, and if the directions in the bill give them instructions on what the rule should do to make sure that X, Y, and Z, we should be all set.
Okay, no, that's your problem. That's not my problem, Senator.
Well, I'm not worried about one ratepayer holding up the works unless the law
Well,
has
I
been
want to
violated.
make sure
Yeah.
that we do not set up
Yeah.
that possibility. It said that if a complaint is filed or unless a complaint is filed. So Luke, can you help us out here?
The language, and it's repeated in each subsection, states, unless an objection to the rate change is filed with the commission within 45 days, et cetera, the rate change goes into effect. So that means if an objection is filed, the rate change does not go into effect. And I believe an individual could file such an objection. I don't know how often that would happen, but it is possible. So this is the kind of thing, if the committee wants to clarify some of these issues and make something possible or not possible, I'm sure we can do it, but please think about that.
That's my concern. I want us to think about. Senator Bray.
So there are provisions, and Mr. Nauer could probably help us with this. For instance, if you want to petition the PUC, 25 or more citizens can, I think that's a threshold for bringing a petition forward, something like that. So there's already places where triggering an official response requires more than one person to show up. Maybe that's helpful in considering a less of a hair trigger, in this case, a single complaint.
Yeah, I think that's what I'm asking. Can we find a reasonable trigger? Senator Hardy.
Thank you. I'm just wondering, is there an organization or an individual that is an advocate or whatever for ratepayers? I'm just thinking, for example, in my other committee in health and welfare, you know, there's the healthcare advocate who often speaks on behalf of, you know, patients. And it seems like in most worlds, there are those kinds of advocates that committees check in regularly. Is there an equivalent here that
I'm going to take a stab at it and I will be corrected, but I believe, and it was even before my time, the Department of Public Service was established to represent ratepayers before the PUC because ratepayers don't have access to the legal and technical talent, but I believe that's still their role, but Tom or Luke, am I
Yes,
right or wrong in that?
I agree with your assessment. The
I
public
agree with
Zero.
your assessment.
Okay, and so it's making sure that they have, that's why they're the gatekeeper in some of these. Okay, Senator Pearson.
Thank you, Tom. I'm wondering if you can help me understand something. It's been presented that the standard rate review is can be time consuming and costly and involve legal battles or the need to hire lawyers at a certain expense, and it's hard for these small utilities. But it's presented as if that's universally bad. And I'm wondering if you can help us understand when a rate case gets a little more complicated, such that it requires legal assistance for the utility and more time. What are some of the examples of things that are getting hashed out there? Because I'm kind of suspect that part of what happens is actually the rate request is put under higher scrutiny, and it's quite possible ratepayers are in fact spared expense because of the lengthened process. So I'm wondering if you can just help us understand, you know, what we're waiving or potentially waiving here.
Yeah, I can give you a little bit of information on that. And I see that Riley just turned on his camera, and I'm sure that he
Oops.
would love to jump in here as well. You know, the utility will file its test year, what they call, and this is all the financial information for a recent year. And then they want to change those rates to reflect known and measurable changes that the utility will be facing. And so, you know, not prejudging what any future or currently pending rate case is about. If the department looks at the utilities case and says, you've assumed this change, we don't consider that to be well known, you've made a bad guess there, or I disagree with your assumptions. Those are the types of things that will be reviewed. So it's really a check on the utilities math and the underlying assumptions.
But maybe you could talk to then the frequency. I mean, is that just standard? The point is, it's onerous. We understand that. I don't think anyone quarrels with the fact that a rate review today is onerous. What I'm trying to understand is it onerous with merit that actually ends up protecting ratepayers? Or otherwise, why would we just not waive it for everybody? I mean, the whole point is a check. And if we're going to agree that it's onerous, aren't we sort of suggesting we don't need the check? That's what I'm struggling with.
Yeah, I think oftentimes the rate cases will not be investigated because the utility and the department will agree, within that 30-day window that Riley mentioned, and then an investigation will not commence. And so it's in those instances where we have two parties that don't agree on the financials or the assumptions, et cetera. And so when those two parties can't agree, then they need someone to adjudicate that. And it's our job. So to think that it's painful, it's funny, because we're not trying to inflict pain on anyone. We're just trying to make sure that the rates are just and reasonable.
Well, is there a trend that you see when you get into an investigation that at the end, does the investigation usually cost ratepayers more money or less money than the proposed that came in? Is there any rule of thumb that you could help us understand?
So I don't have that information at hand. Are you saying that, so the utility comes in with a certain proposal, and when the matter is finally adjudicated, are ratepayers, do they end up paying less after our process? I can't answer that right now, but I'd be happy to look at.
Yeah, it's sort of been presented that the onerous nature of the rate review is bad. It costs utilities a lot of money. It's, and that is probably quantifiable. But what is not being discussed is, well, what happens for ratepayers after this process? It's not an arbitrary process. We go through that long and painful process for a reason. And ultimately, I think it's because we have an eye on ratepayers. So that's what I'm trying to get my head around. Any help you could offer would
yeah. So we maintain a spreadsheet, and I can kind of summarize that and provide it to the committee, and maybe this will help to answer your question. Utility X came in looking for a rate case of 17%. And at the end of the day, the commission approved an 8% increase. Is that the kind of thing you're looking for? Okay.
Well, you just saved ratepayers in your hypothetical 9%. And so far, nobody's talked about that. We've talked about the expense of the lawyers. And that's really concerning to me. I'd love to have some snapshot of that.
Okay, could we limit that snapshot to the munis and co-ops?
Yes.
Because
Yeah.
that's who we're talking about. And remember that the cost of the lawyers is also borne by the taxpayer, by the ratepayer.
Of course.
So you don't have to spend $300,000 on lawyers. That's money saved too. So it's a balancing game. Riley, can you add anything to this?
Yeah, I think I can, and I apologize for actually not, hitting this one earlier, because it's really important. There's a cost and there's a benefit, and we've had, I think, something in the neighborhood of 82 tariff request increases over the last kind of 18 years from co-ops and munis. I'd say about 25% of the time, somewhere between 25 and 30% of the time, that those actually lead to some degree of a more formal step in the process that will lead to, contentious rate case potentially. When I looked at kind of those rate cases, and I looked at the request, and I looked at with the award, the difference was in the neighborhood of 150 when you include both, $150,000 per rate case. Let's see, yeah, 135,000 per rate case for the munis and co-ops combined, and about 100,000 for the munis individually. It usually takes a few percentage points off of the rate request. But from our standpoint, the benefit isn't just about those dollar amounts. I mean, just remember that, if you reduce rates by 100,000, that lives on for years afterwards. So you're really talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars for ratepayers that have, a many year kind of benefit for the ratepayers. But it also goes the other way. That is, sometimes what we learn is that the utility doesn't actually have adequate rate revenues for what it needs to do. There have been instances in the past where they've come in for rates, and they've come in for one rate, and we've actually worked out that they actually need more than the request. But by and large, what we do is, represent ratepayers and lower rates. And at least in my sample of 17 municipal cases that were where there was more litigation, it resulted in about 100,000 per case.
Well, if we could get that data, it sure would help me.
Okay.
Okay. Any other questions? All right, Melissa.
I know we're short on time. I just really want to clarify.
No, we've canceled one witness, so we're good.
My testimony and the cost estimates really were not intended to capture the litigious process where there is contention between regulators and utilities. And I just want to be really clear. I think S60 does not envision avoiding that process where there is a substantive issue to negotiate with regulators. So really the burden we're trying to alleviate is the upfront burden on the utilities that costs anywhere from $30,000 to $40,000 and results in a 100-page filing, and whether that burden is commensurate with the value undertaken by those activities. So again, I just want to be really clear that we're not trying to avoid, the way that I see it, those cases that are contested now and litigated now would continue to be litigated and contested because the department would see the information filed by the utility and they would raise the same concerns that they're raising now. So this is really about, can there be a more efficient process for non-contentious minor rate adjustments? And I just want to clarify because it seems like the focus has shifted to the litigation, and as we've testified, that is rare.
Okay, Senator Bray and then Senator Brock.
So just to check back in with Ms. Bailey, so the eligibility for this program is having first gone through a major rate case, correct? Right? So all the sort of scrutiny that we're concerned should happen has to happen before you would ever get into the provisions of S60. And then the other piece is, for me, I just don't want to lose sight of, at a moment where we're talking to utilities about being more flexible and innovative, that we need to, I think my understanding is we're trying to create a regulatory paradigm that allows for that flexibility and innovation without coming back for a rate case. Is that, I don't want to be putting words in your mouth. Is that accurate, Ms. Bailey?
That is accurate. There is the initial gatekeeper that we would need a traditional rate case in order to implement any kind of minor rate adjustments and utilize the flexibility. And to the piece about innovation, agreed, we are extremely cost conscious and we want to free up resources to do more of that innovation, and potentially reducing the burden on the formal rate making process side would free up those resources to potentially be more responsive and do more of the flexible innovation that the regulators are seeking from the utilities. So we see them as kind of going hand in hand.
Okay. And if I may, Madam Chair, just one more question, I think probably for Mr. Riley. I mean, Mr. Riley, I do this all the time. Mr. Allen, in terms of, we were talking about a trigger for a complaint triggering a full rate case. Do you play some sort of role already where you are sort of the gatekeepers, whether or not a complaint then merits a full rate case? You know, we're trying to, it sounds like we want it to be responsive. We're interested in a trigger, but we don't want it to be a hair trigger that goes off too often. Is that a role that the department already plays in some way or could play in this situation?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah, I mean, we can always request an investigation, and the commission can always, initiate an investigation in its own right. We receive customer complaints all the time about our utilities. We will look at the different aspects of things and figure out whether the concerns have merit, and if they have merit, then we will request an investigation. So I think we can distinguish one ratepayer kind of frustrated with their utility from the underlying concerns that they're representing. And we can look at, whether it's one or five or more ratepayers and weigh the underlying concerns that they're representing. If they seem valid, we will initiate an investigation or a request for an investigation.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Senator Brock, you moved.
Just a quick question for all of the people sitting around the virtual table here today, the utilities as well as the regulators, as well as the deciders. In the event that this request by the utilities is granted, do you see any material harm likely happening? Are there compensating controls that would prevent that, such as the complaint process? And do you believe that the public ultimately would benefit from a more streamlined, less time-consuming, and less costly process that might allow resources to be deployed more productively?
Yeah, so I'll start and say that, yeah, we think that this actually does make sense. We think that it is a balance issue. It is trying to get, what is the right balance between the cost and benefit. We think some measure of flexibility, recognizing that there are inherent kind of local controls and thresholds and consumer protections are out there, do make sense. And then it's a question of, well, what are the guardrails and what are the boundaries? There's I think a comparatively small difference between us and the utilities here. I think we're both supportive and trying to pull in the same direction. We have still a lot of levers, and I think Melissa has laid out all the areas of transparency. I've alluded to the consumer guardrails. We have a lot of regulatory protections that will exist with or without this legislation. So we think this is appropriate and sensible, and I guess I'll stop there. Thanks.
Okay.
I agree with Riley.
Yeah, there you go. You agree with Riley. Okay. Andrea, you've popped up. Do you want to?
Just want to let you know I'm still here, and I agree with Riley as well. We didn't talk that much about the co-op governance structure, but there is a lot of notice, a lot of accountability. We have elected board members. There's 12 board members representing their communities. And we notice meetings and things are all very transparent on our website. And, we really go above and beyond to make sure our members have the information and are engaged with our process. So it's kind of one of those things we welcome, frankly, the scrutiny and the accountability, but we also really see opportunities to just be more efficient. We've been doing this for a long time. We all know where the value is being added and where it's not. And I think it's a great time to just kind of revisit this and see where we can streamline a little bit in these very limited situations.
And I would just echo what's been said. We see that there's adequate guardrails in the proposed legislation and allows for flexibility and cost savings where the parties generally agree, and still maintains the existing process as a backstop when there is disagreement.
Okay. If there are no further questions, I want to say thank you to the witnesses. Committee, be back at 3:30. We're trying to move the commissioner back earlier, so we will have more time to talk about how we want to advise on broadband, if we do, in the quick spending bill, and who we need to hear from in order to do that. Senator Hardy.
Just quickly before we leave this topic, I don't have any more questions, but I just want to put in a request that next time we come to it, Luke has, or whomever we have as our attorney at that point, has some language with the highlighted suggestions from everybody, so we can track it in the actual bill better.
I think next time, unless we feel we want to hear from somebody else, we'll do a walkthrough and look at the language and look at the proposals and decide where we want to go. Okay.
I was trying to keep a running list, but I'm sure I missed something. So it would be helpful.
We'll do a walkthrough, and we can do the proposed amendments and put them in yellow or green or whatever.
Thanks.
Okay. So thank you, committee, everyone. Be back, and I think now it's like, be back in 15 minutes, okay?